It is the bitter, freezing winter of 1814, and a shadow of absolute dread is creeping across the Atlantic Ocean. The British Empire has just achieved the seemingly impossible. After over a decade of apocalyptic, continent-spanning warfare, they have finally defeated the great French conqueror, Napoleon Bonaparte. With the battlefields of Europe completely secured and their greatest rival exiled, Britain suddenly has an overwhelming surplus of military power, and now they turn their terrifying, undisputed might toward their annoying, rebellious former colonies. Their ultimate target is not a barren fortress or a sleepy coastal village. It is the undisputed crown jewel of the American South, the gateway to the entire continent's interior, the glittering, wealthy port city of New Orleans. To seize this incredibly strategic prize, Britain does not send a mere raiding party. They dispatch a colossal armada carrying a staggering force of over 10,000 elite, battle-hardened veterans.
These are not fresh recruits. These are the very same ruthless, highly disciplined men who just broke the mighty French Empire under the command of the Duke of Wellington. They are accustomed to victory, they are heavily armed, and they are hungry for the spoils of an immensely wealthy American city. Defending New Orleans is Major General Andrew Jackson, a gaunt, fiercely determined commander suffering from dysentery and carrying unhealed bullet wounds from past duels. But Jackson's sheer willpower cannot change the catastrophic mathematical reality of his situation. His Continental regulars are hopelessly outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied by the approaching British juggernaut. To save the city from being completely sacked and burned to the ground, Jackson desperately needs an army, and he needs one immediately.
And what he ultimately puts together in the damp swamps of Louisiana is, without a doubt, the most bizarre, absolute fever dream of a military alliance in American history. This is the incredible, blood-soaked story of how a completely patched-together mob of swamp pirates, Native American warriors, free men of color, and ragtag frontiersmen went toe-to-toe with the most powerful military machine on the face of the earth. They didn't just hold the line against the unstoppable British Empire. They orchestrated a flawless, horrific 30-minute slaughter that humiliated the British crown forever. When Andrew Jackson finally arrived in the muddy, panic-stricken streets of New Orleans, the situation he inherited was nothing short of a military catastrophe. He had a severe, paralyzing shortage of men. He had practically no flint to spark their muskets, and a desperate, terrifying lack of heavy artillery to counter the guns of the Royal Navy. If the elite British veterans marched on the city right then, it would not be a battle. It would be a localized massacre. Jackson was a proud, stubborn man, but he was also a realist. He was so completely desperate that he turned to a man with a massive federal bounty hanging over his head, the infamous Jean Lafitte. Lafitte was a notorious, charismatic French pirate and smuggler who ran a massive, highly lucrative illicit empire hidden deep within the treacherous swamps of Barataria Bay.
The British, recognizing Lafitte's immense value and intimate knowledge of the local waterways, had actually tried to bribe the pirate to join their invasion force. They offered him a captaincy in the Royal Navy, vast sums of gold, and a full pardon. Instead, Lafitte took their highly sensitive military intelligence straight to the Americans. Lafitte offered General Jackson everything he desperately lacked: his highly trained, battle-hardened pirate artillerymen, thousands of precious flints, and heavy naval cannons salvaged from captured ships. Jackson, who had previously despised these smugglers and publicly referred to Lafitte's men as hellish banditti, was forced to swallow his pride. He shook the pirates' hand and made the deal. But the pirates were just the beginning of this surreal coalition. Jackson's military camp at Chalmette looked less like a professional, organized army and more like a chaotic, boisterous frontier tavern.
Walking through the muddy encampment, you would find deadly Choctaw warriors, men who deeply despised the British and were armed with tomahawks and war clubs, ready to spill blood in the swamps. You would see two entire, highly disciplined battalions of free black men, consisting of wealthy Creole aristocrats, proudly fighting side by side with formerly enslaved men to defend their homes. And finally, pouring out of the dense woods came the men known as the Dirty Shirts, wild, rugged, and untested frontiersmen traveling down the river from Tennessee and Kentucky. Dressed in tattered buckskin and carrying devastatingly accurate, long-barreled Kentucky rifles, they looked completely feral. This grand army spoke a dozen different languages. They openly hated each other's commanders, and they possessed absolutely zero formal military discipline. To the pristine, highly drilled British commanders anchored off the coast, this American force was an absolute joke, a rabble of peasants pretending to be soldiers. But General Jackson knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't need this motley crew to march in perfect, synchronized squares on an open field. He just needed them to stand their ground and shoot straight. Jackson's true military genius lay not in complex cavalry maneuvers, but in his profound understanding of the unforgiving local terrain. The geographical approach to New Orleans was a complete nightmare for an invading army. To reach the lucrative city, the British forces had to march across the Chalmette plantation, navigating through a narrow, highly restrictive, swampy bottleneck. On their left flank flowed the deep, raging, impassable currents of the Mississippi River. On their right flank lay an absolutely impenetrable, snake-infested cypress swamp. Recognizing that the British could not spread out their massive numbers to overwhelm him, Jackson chose an old, dry mill canal cutting directly across this natural bottleneck, and ordered every single man in his bizarre army to dig. Slaves, soldiers, aristocrats, and pirates dug furiously, side by side, in the freezing, thick Louisiana mud. They worked day and night, constructing a massive, heavily fortified earthwork wall that would become famously known as Line Jackson. They scooped up the thick, sticky mud, reinforced the crumbling walls with heavy timber, and, according to enduring local legend, even stuffed the barricades with dense cotton bales to absorb incoming artillery fire. Behind this imposing wall of freezing mud, Jackson meticulously arranged his deadly chess pieces. He placed Lafitte's veteran pirates squarely on the heavy naval guns, knowing these outlaws could fire a 24-pound cannon with sniper-like precision. He packed the rugged Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen alongside the disciplined, free black militias, tightly along the ramparts, their long rifles resting perfectly on the mud parapets.
Finally, he sent his fiercely independent Choctaw warriors deep into the dense, dark cypress swamp on the far right flank, ordering them to silently ambush and slaughter anyone foolish enough to try and bypass the American line through the trees. The Americans were now completely dug in. There was absolutely no way around their fortifications. If the mighty British Army wanted to take New Orleans, they could not outmaneuver Jackson. They would have to march straight forward in tightly packed columns directly into the screaming teeth of the American guns. The morning of January 8th, 1815, was hauntingly quiet. The air was freezing, and a thick, heavy, blinding fog rolled off the Mississippi River, completely covering the Chalmette battlefield. In the eerie silence, the American defenders gripped their weapons, their breath pluming in the cold air. Then, cutting through the damp morning mist, came a chilling, unmistakable sound. The distant, rhythmic wail of Scottish bagpipes playing a martial tune, accompanied by the terrifying, synchronized thud of thousands of combat boots marching in perfect unison. British General Sir Edward Pakenham, a highly decorated and supremely confident aristocrat, had officially ordered a full-scale frontal assault. He firmly believed that the mere sight of his invincible, battle-hardened veterans, the conquerors of Napoleon, would cause the undisciplined, cowardly American militia to break ranks and run for their lives in sheer terror. As the freezing fog finally began to lift, it revealed an utterly terrifying, awe-inspiring sight. Thousands upon thousands of British redcoats, their bayonets gleaming in the morning light, marching forward in immaculate, terrifying precision. Behind the mud walls, General Jackson raised his sword. Down the line, the rough, tattooed pirate artillerists held their glowing matches inches above the touch holes of their massive cannons. The Americans didn't break, they didn't run. They waited in absolute, disciplined silence until the gleaming red wall of British infantry was perfectly, inevitably in range. And then Jackson brought his sword down and gave the order to fire. The mud ramparts absolutely erupted in a blinding flash of white and orange. Lafitte's pirate artillerymen unleashed a devastating, ear-shattering storm of grape shot, cloth bags filled with iron balls that essentially turned their cannons into giant shotguns. The grape shot tore massive, bloody, gaping holes directly through the immaculate British formations, instantly shredding dozens of men with a single blast. Simultaneously, the Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen rose up from behind the cotton bales. Firing their long rifles with deadly, practiced accuracy, they intentionally ignored the rank-and-file soldiers and ruthlessly picked off the British commanding officers one by one, instantly throwing the advancing columns into total chaos. It was not a battle, it was an absolute slaughter. To make matters infinitely worse, the British 44th Regiment had made a fatal, unforgivable logistical error. They had forgotten to bring their fascines and wooden scaling ladders to the front. When the surviving redcoats finally reached the American line, they found it physically impossible to climb the steep, slippery mud walls of the canal. They were hopelessly trapped in an open, muddy ditch, completely exposed to a relentless, unyielding hail of lead and iron raining down from above. Realizing his army was being systematically annihilated, General Pakenham frantically rode his horse directly to the front lines to rally his panicked, wavering troops. It was a brave but foolish gesture. Within moments, the British commander was violently blown off his horse, his spine shattered by a blast of American grape shot, dying agonizingly on the battlefield as his army crumbled around him. The vaunted discipline of the British Empire meant absolutely nothing against an impenetrable wall of mud, pirate cannons, and point-blank rifle fire. In less than 30 minutes, the main British assault force was completely and utterly annihilated. Unable to take the devastating punishment any longer, the remnants of the invincible British army finally broke. They turned their backs and ran for their lives into the swamp, leaving the field carpeted with the dead and dying. When the thick sulphurous gun smoke finally cleared from the Chalmette battlefield, a slow, mournful silence fell over the Louisiana swamps. The reality of what had just transpired in that 30-minute window was almost impossible for anyone on either side to comprehend. The casualty numbers were staggering, defying all military logic. The mighty British Empire had suffered over 2,000 casualties, losing thousands of their finest veteran soldiers, their senior officers, and their commanding general. And the bizarre, makeshift, patched-together American army of pirates and outcasts? They had lost less than a dozen men. To this day, it remains one of the most lopsided, devastatingly one-sided defeats in the entire centuries-long history of the British military. But the most incredible, paradoxical part of this entire bloody saga, it technically shouldn't have even happened. Thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean, diplomats had been fiercely negotiating an end to the conflict. Due to the agonizingly slow speed of transatlantic communication by sailing ship, neither General Jackson nor General Pakenham had any idea that the Treaty of Ghent had actually been signed in Europe several weeks earlier. The War of 1812 was already officially, legally over before a single musket was fired at New Orleans. Yet, despite taking place after the peace treaty was signed, this spectacular post-war battle changed the trajectory of the North American continent forever. Jackson's unbelievable victory permanently secured the vast Louisiana territory from any future European claims, effectively locking down the western frontier. It instantly transformed Andrew Jackson from a regional militia commander into a legendary, mythic national hero, catapulting him directly toward the presidency of the United States. Most importantly, the Battle of New Orleans proved to the entire world that the fledgling United States was not a temporary experiment. It was a permanent, formidable, and dangerously capable power that could not be bullied, intimidated, or easily conquered. It turns out, all it took to utterly humble the world's greatest empire was a brilliant, iron-willed general, a wall of sticky swamp mud, and a bizarre army of pirates, natives, and outcasts who simply refused to back down.